Thanks very much, Deborah, for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this morning on behalf of the BMJ to discuss the fundamentals and benefits of sharing participant-level clinical trial data. I will aim to cover exactly what it is we're thinking about sharing. Deborah alluded to some of the problems and the definitions and the fact that different people mean different things when they speak of sharing particular parts of the data set. And I'll also aim to make at least a case for why it is we should share and what some of the benefits of sharing might be. Now, I'm here today in my capacity as a research editor for the BMJ, but I'm also here in my capacity as a doctor who treats patients and who therefore relies on clinical trial data to make everyday clinical and treatment decisions. And I'm here as someone who in the past has participated as a clinical investigator in many multi-center randomized clinical trials. So I've seen how the data are collected and some of the ways in which it can go wrong. And finally, I'm here in the same capacity that many of you are, and that is as a future patient and as the relative and friend of future patients who will rely on clinical trial data. And I think it's that last perspective that is very helpful to bear in mind as we go through discussing the possibilities and problems associated with making these data more available. So, what is it that we mean when we bandy about these phrases, such as individual participant data or individual patient data, raw data, and so forth? There is a lot of ambiguity sometimes, and people are not always clear on what exactly we are talking about. And because it's important that we have a shared understanding of the way in which data are generated in the course of a clinical trial and exactly what we might be referring to when we use some of these phrases, let's go through the process of data collection, data coding, and data aggregation that occurs in a typical clinical trial. And you can think of it as a multi-center trial where there are multiple individual sites possibly spread around the country or the globe, or a trial that takes place in one center. The problems are often quite similar. So here you see some case report forms. These happen to be handwritten case report forms. It's increasingly common now to use computerized forms and to enter data electronically. And these are paper or electronic questionnaires on which or in which the data from each trial participant in each clinical site is collected. And it's all collected on these case report forms and documented on these forms. Now, as you can see, these forms are sometimes far from perfect. Here you see scribbling in the margins and a lot of entries that are not immediately understandable. So these case report forms have to be processed and sent to study administrators or whoever is coordinating and organizing the study, but they are rarely perfect. So study monitors are hired to audit the data. They go to the individual site, or sometimes they audit the data electronically from afar, but in either case, their duty is to make sure that these case report forms contain the correct data. And when they have questions or data are missing or do not make sense, that generates a query back to the investigator or the study staff that has to be resolved before anything else happens. So these questions about entries have to be explained. For example, a weight might have been entered as 750 kilograms, which is implausible, and the study monitor might query that and say, did you mean 75 kilograms? Information might be missing. A male might be listed as being on birth control, and so forth and so on. So each query has to be explained and resolved before the data are entered into the coordinating center database. And at several points along the way, some types of data are coded or categorized, and we'll talk particularly about how that happens with adverse event data. At the coordinating center, there's a process of data entry, and we hope a process of double checking to make sure that data entry is correct. And sometimes in the process of data entry, additional queries about the data are generated. Another data clarification form has to be generated. There's another process and another round of querying back to the original investigator and the study staff. So this is an example of the process through which the uncoded data are transformed into coded data in at least some cases and then aggregated and entered into a database. And many people who speak about individual participant data are speaking about having access to the individual de-identified records that reside in that computerized database, but not always. And I think it's worth considering for a moment some of the challenges involved in coding adverse events, where some of the prior documents might be of great interest. So as you can imagine, misclassification of adverse events in clinical trials can have very, very serious consequences. And so systems have evolved to try to minimize the scope for interpretation and incorrect classification of adverse events. And adverse events are usually categorized using some sort of predefined hierarchy or system. And here you see, for example, how symptoms consistent with the common cold might be identified and categorized. Now, patients don't necessarily come in saying, I have a respiratory disorder. They come in saying they have a runny nose, their eyes are itchy, and they're sneezing, and someone has to make the decision that that represents a cold. So there's a lot of scope for interpretation along the way, particularly with data that hasn't been anticipated, as is the case with many adverse events or side effects. And one study reported that when two people were coding adverse events, about 12% of the time they did not agree in important ways. And in situations where doctors have gone back and looked at the case report forms of the patient descriptions of adverse events, about 8% of the time they feel that they haven't been coded correctly. And there certainly are more egregious cases, for example, in clinical trials involving antidepressants, where adverse events such as suicidal behavior or gestures were coded as things like emotional lability or coded as an admission to the hospital. So I think you can see some of the reason that coding generates a certain amount of concern and why some people want access to some of the earlier data. So what is it we're thinking of sharing? Well, here's a typical call for data is all data from randomized clinical trials, including raw anonymized data. And Peter Gutcha, in his editorial on this matter after the Cochrane collaboration issued its statement in favor of sharing data from clinical trials, is very specific. He says raw data about adverse events should mean the original descriptions exactly as reported narratively by patients or researchers, and he says on the case report forms before any coding or adjudication has taken place for categorization purposes. So the Cochrane collaboration has issued a typical statement advocating sharing data, and you see it reproduced here. They call for all data from all trials. They specify raw, anonymized individual participant data, and they ask for these, along with the trial protocol, to be publicly available free of charge and in easily accessible electronic formats. And as Dr. Zarin mentioned, the purpose in most people wanting access to these sorts of data is to enhance the understanding of what happened in an individual clinical trial, but beyond that, to enhance the understanding of what happened to individual participants within that trial. So here's an example of individual participant data that comes from a paper published in the BMJ that looked at issues surrounding individual participant data meta-analyses. And this happens to be individual participant data from 10 trials, but it gives you the flavor of the sort of individual participant data you might be able to glean from records for an individual trial. So if you look at the top there, in the first study, the first patient, patient 1 there, is a 46-year-old man. He was in the treatment group, and his pre-treatment systolic blood pressure was 137, and his post-treatment systolic blood pressure was 111. You can see the same data for the second participant in that trial, and you can see data for individual participants from all the different clinical trial sites if you're looking at a data set that has aggregated information for individual participants among clinical trials. Now, what's the advantage to having this detailed data? Because, of course, we could simply tote up all the blood pressures pre and post treatment for the two groups and present the average or the median. But, of course, information is lost. And in particular, collecting data and having data available to analyze at the level of the individual participant enables you to apply different staging or grading procedures, for example, And it allows straightforward categorization of subgroups so that you can examine whether or not there might be any subgroup benefits or harms. Here's a comparison of the power of meta-analyses done with individual patient data compared with meta-analyses on the same topic done with aggregate data, showing that as a rule, meta-analyses done with individual participant data are much more likely to be able to detect treatment effects that differ across groups, across different ages, for example, different sexes, or other subgroups. And I think all of this reminds us of that famous phrase, the title of an essay by Stephen Jay Gould, "The median is not the message." And certainly in clinical trials, very frequently one is interested in identifying subgroup effects. Now, historically, the currency of clinical trial publications and the currency of meta-analyses has been summary level data, but that is changing, and you see here a graphic depiction of the increase, the substantial increase over time in the number of individual participant data analyses. So this has become a subject of great interest to many people who realize the advantages. I want to spend a little bit of our remaining time going over some of the advantages that might accrue from sharing individual participant data, and as you'll recognize, these generally are likely to accrue sharing any sort of trial data. So one of the things that one hears about before we talk about the advantages is who exactly are we talking about sharing the data with? And it's useful to think about the continuum of sharing that is possible. So historically, there have been situations in which the only place where all of the data reside and can be examined are with the sponsor. Sometimes they have even not made available to individual researchers in a multi-center trial the data that they have generated from their own center or the data that has been generated by the trial overall. Some trial agreements specify that investigators may not necessarily have access to that, or if they do, their publications and research proposals generated from it have to be approved by the sponsor. It's also possible, of course, to decide that you'll share data with the clinical trial investigators or with other approved investigators, meaning that you might reserve the right to vet their data and decide if they're going to be doing the research and the analysis in a way that you think is robust. Or you might make it available to any researchers as long as they can show that they have a genuine research interest in this question and a track record of research capability. Or you might go further, and this is what I think many people will advocate and the goal to which we should aspire and share with everyone. And why might we want to make clinical trial data more available? Well, there are many, many advocates who have gone on record in favor of this, and here are just a few of them. And here are the phrases that resonate through their statements, and you'll recognize words like trust and respect and quality and efficiency. Individuals as well as organizations have gone on record in favor of this. And I think the reasons can be grouped into two categories, two main themes. The first is the moral and ethical arguments in favor of sharing clinical trial data, and the second theme, I think, is the practical and scientific arguments. And of course, many of the arguments transcend category and have elements of both of these arguments within them. They are, of course, very similar to the arguments that have been mounted before for other forms of transparency in the clinical trial research enterprise, namely registration of clinical trials and so forth. So I think in some ways this is the natural evolution of information wanting to be free. Another reason that's often mentioned is obligations to research participants. They participate in clinical research, at least in part, on the understanding that their data may not benefit them, but will perhaps benefit others. And how can it really do that to its full extent if it is under lock and key and can only be viewed by certain people? Certainly, Dr. Dryad in his recent editorial said we owe these people respect, not only the people who have been in clinical trials, but also, I would submit to you, the people who are going to be in clinical trials in the future. And many of you are no doubt familiar with the early phase trial that went very badly wrong in England a number of years ago. And there have been a number of commentators who have suggested that perhaps the adverse events that befell the 6 participants in this trial could have been prevented if earlier work on this compound had been published and available to people. It's also the case that many people claim that medical research is a public good. Now, President Obama landed himself in hot water a while ago when he said to business people about their businesses, "You didn't build that." In other words, that it wasn't necessarily, when you form a business, a completely private act. And I think that argument actually applies very well to medical research. Medical research is a public good. It's aimed primarily at producing a public good, which is the knowledge that's needed to attack important societal health problems. And the money argument also resonates. The fact is that taxpayers, the public, provides a huge amount of money to support basic research, a huge amount of NIH money. They support directly and indirectly the public universities where research is carried out. So I think there is an argument that the public, which then ends up paying for many of the products of that research, should be handed perhaps a better deal. We had an issue earlier this year in the BMJ, a theme issue that I handled, about what are the effects of missing trial data and what might be the effects of making it more publicly available. And one myth that I think was dispelled by a paper that appeared in that issue of the journal is very important. And that is that I think if we polled this audience or asked the man on the street, if hidden clinical trial data came to light, what do you think its effect would be on our estimates of the harms and benefits of existing therapies? I think the average person would say it would be likely to change our estimate so that we think those things are less effective. Now, in fact, that's not true. We don't really know how things would be affected if those trial data were released. We don't know the direction in which the results would move. And this paper showed that when unpublished FDA trial data were added to meta-analyses of existing therapies, only 7% of the time did the estimate not change, but when it changed, about half the time it changed to make the compound or treatment look more effective and half the time less effective. So we don't even know what we don't know until we have the trial data. Another argument is that availability of trial data will accelerate research by making available information to more scientists, and that research will be more productive and things will happen a lot faster. And certainly these social network diagrams show the extent of collaboration and cooperation among scientists already, but just imagine how much deeper and richer the connections might be and how many more of them there might be if they had clinical trial research data available to work with. Now, it's also the case, I think, that we can imagine certain scientific collaborations occurring, but there are probably stakeholders out there who would be able to contribute importantly to scientific research and make use of these data in ways that we cannot currently imagine. And I'm speaking about citizen science. Now, the former music director and conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Serge Koussevitzky, was known to utter many, sometimes I think unintentionally poetic statements because he was not a native English speaker. And one of the things he said, I think, applies here. He said, "The next Beethoven will from Colorado come." And in saying that, he was recognizing, I think, that genius and inspiration and ingenuity do not reside in the usual places, but may actually be found in places that we do not expect. And here you see, I think, how that could be transcribed to apply to a situation where a high school student came up with a very interesting scientific project and was able to say that it happened because he had access to freely available online scientific information. So how many collaborators are there out there that we can't even imagine at this point who might make use of the data? And the final reason that I want to advance for sharing clinical trial data, individual participant data, as well as general data, is that it would help restore trust in the clinical research enterprise, which is at an all-time low. And there's a crisis in recruitment for clinical trials, and many clinical trials fail because of serious recruitment problems. When the citizenry is surveyed about their views of pharmaceutical companies and the pharmaceutical endeavors that are underway, only 14% of them say that it is an honest business, and that's right down there with tobacco companies and the used car industry. I think that we can probably do better. I don't think ads like this, touting participants as heroes, are likely to do as much good as the perception that the data that are generated from their participation will be put to good use now and in the future. And finally, it is essential to counter the cynicism that has arisen among doctors. And this study, which recently generated so much media attention, showed that studies of superior methodological rigor were discounted by physicians when they perceived that they had been funded by industry. Now, that earned a reproof from the editor of the journal, but many commentators have pointed out that doctors may have very good historical reasons to be skeptical. Whatever the reason, this distrust is very serious, because if doctors don't believe the evidence, what hope is there for evidence-based medicine? If they don't believe the clinical trials on which the guidelines are based, we can't expect them to act in ways that are based on evidence and that are consistent. So there are many problems. I'll mention just one. Where do we put all these individual patient data? What do we do with it? Where do we store them? Well, here's one solution that has arisen in response to this anticipated problem. This is a screenshot of Dryad, which is an online data repository where authors for BMJ Open can put their data, all of their data. And you'll hear today, I think, of many other inspired and inspiring examples of solutions to all the problems that will be that have been anticipated. Now, there are, of course, going to be problems we don't anticipate, but I believe those will be balanced by benefits that we don't anticipate. I have confidence in human and scientific ingenuity, and I think it is certainly the case we've only scratched the surface today in thinking about the benefits that might accrue from making clinical trial data more publicly accessible. Now, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that the matters we're discussing today mean that we're really engaged in one of the great struggles of human knowledge, and that is the struggle to liberate clinical trial information and make sure it is put to its best and highest use now and in the future. So it's a thrill to be part of this historic meeting, and I thank you for your attention.